This is what is this? This is a review of the Forget the Alamo book, What I'm Looking For. This book is extremely well written. Most of you should have very little trouble reading it. It's written to be a popular book, not kind of the usual boring history text. Um, so I didn't assign the introduction, and if I don't assign it in the syllabus, I can't assignment. Your syllabus is a legal document, but you might want to take a look at the introduction just because it's really funny. It talks about some of the things that have happened at the Alamo. Phil Collins, the rock singer, he's going to play a role in this book. He's given a lot of artifacts to Texas about the Alamo. Now it's unclear if these artifacts are the genuine deal. Just some of the funny things that have happened or outrageous, depending on your point of view, at the Alamo, and kind of setting up the book. So I'm not assigning you the intro. I'm not going to test you on it, but it would take you 5 or 10 minutes to look at it. And for those of you that are interested, I think you'll get a kick out of it. It talks about the kind of things that history books don't usually talk about, which is good, I think. So just really briefly, what I want you to look for in this book is, and I'm going to lecture on this in detail so in my podcast, so I'm not going to go over too much here. Pages 6 to 11, the revolt in Texas against Spain in 1813. Texas becomes part of the larger Mexican revolt against Spain, because remember, Texas is still part of Mexico. And this revolt is ruthlessly suppressed by General Arredondo, the Spanish general, who comes up here and just basically almost depopulates Texas. He cuts the population of Texas almost in half. The population in this, when I say population, I'm talking about the European people of European descent. There were probably, we don't know, between 20 and 30,000 Indians, maybe, yeah, no one really knows for sure. So when I'm talking about population, I'm talking about folks of European descent. Very tiny if you think about it. And this is one of the big themes of this course, is that Spain never really populates Texas. But after the revolt of 1813, the failed revolt, the population of Texas is almost cut in half. It's quite devastating. And the reason I make such a big deal out of this is setting up the significance of when Anglos start to come into Texas, beginning in the early 1820s. That's when Texas is going to be populated. Why are they coming here? They're coming here to grow cotton. What do they need to grow cotton? They need to have slavery, to pick the cotton and all the horrors of the slave trade. But that's getting ahead of the story. One of the points that I want you to note, beginning on page 11, is that Spain has basically no way to suppress the Comanche. The Comanche are far more powerful in Texas than the Spanish, just by an infinite degree. And what's happening, and he talks about this on page 11, the Comanche just start stealing horses like crazy. And who are they selling the horses to? They're selling them to Americans, because Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, these are areas of the US South that are growing very, very quickly, because they're becoming the centers of the growth of cotton in the US. There's cotton grown in other states, but Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama are really the center of cotton production in the US. And there's this insatiable demand for horses in this part of the US, which is just right next door to Texas. And so note that the Comanches are just making the lives of the Spanish in Texas miserable. They're stealing, I think I wrote this thing, I think it's supposed to be 10,000 horses from Refugio in one raid. It's just nuts. And it's because of this that the Spanish are going to open the doors of Texas to Anglo settlers, because they figure, well, maybe if the Anglos come down here, the Anglo-Americans, and of course they'd be bringing their captives with them, maybe they can help fight the Comanches. So it's important to note that the Comanches going wild is one of the reasons that the Spanish government and then the Mexican government opens the door to Texas, to Anglo-Americans and to slaves, which really turns out to be a huge mistake, because That's why Texas is lost. Anyway, that's again getting ahead of our story. Note, and Antonio Martinez, the governor of San Antonio, he's got a quote about how screwed up it is here in 1819. By the time Moses Austin gets here in 1820, Texas is just a mess. It's still reeling from the revolution of 1813. Arredondo coming up here, killing hundreds of people, men, women, and children in San Antonio. And in Nacogdoches. So Texas is reeling. There's a major flood in San Antonio in 1819. Texas is in horrible shape. And you need to understand that, because that's why Spain rolls the dice and opens the door to US settlement, which Mexico will allow later. Okay, the Adams-Onis Treaty, I'll talk about that in a separate podcast. That sets the final boundaries of East Texas, but I'm going to talk about that in a separate podcast. Now, in chapter 2, he talks about, they talk about Moses Austin and do a good description of what he was doing down here, what he asked of the Spanish and why they said yes. The story of Bastrop's really interesting, who helps persuade the Spanish government to open Texas to Americans. And Bastrop's kind of a con man. He's not a baron. He's from the Netherlands. But anyway, he's well situated. So look at that story. Austin, now when I talk about Austin, now I'm talking about Stephen F. Austin, Moses Austin's son. And when you listen to my podcasts, I talk about this in great detail. So don't get frustrated if this doesn't make sense to you right now. I'm just giving you an overview. Note that Austin is anti-slavery, not because he has any moral issues with slavery. It's just he's terrified there's going to be a slave revolt. And the reason for this is that there had been a slave revolt in Haiti in the 1790s, just 2 decades earlier, which had killed hundreds of thousands of people, mostly slaves. But the French had gotten run out of Haiti. The slaves won this war. And slaveholders in the South were terrified by the Haitian example. And the book doesn't mention this. It doesn't talk much about background, but this is why Austin's terrified of a slave revolt. He doesn't like slavery because he thinks slavery will be so successful that ultimately there'll be more slaves than whites, and the slaves are going to revolt, and it's going to be horrific, like Haiti. But he knows that no US settlers will come into Texas without slavery, so he supports the introduction of slavery, okay? Page 21, 22, note that Tejanos in Texas are very supportive of the introduction of slavery into Texas. This is a theme that I'll develop over the next 2 weeks. Tejanos weren't anti-slavery, just the reverse. They were the only Mexicans that were pro-slavery. The rest of Mexico basically was anti-slavery, but the folks in northern Mexico, the leading Tejanos in northern Mexico, and also folks in Saltillo, you had a faction that was very, very pro-slavery because they want cotton. Why do they want cotton? Because they want money. And you can't have cotton without slavery. So one of the big themes I want you to take from the course is how supportive Tejano leaders like the Seguins, like the De Zabalas, are with the introduction of slavery into Texas. And the Seguins and Stephen F. Austin are especially close. Note on page 24 that slaveholders are reluctant from the US, are reluctant to come into Texas because most Mexicans are anti-slavery. The government in Mexico City is anti-slavery. And I'll talk about this, but I'll introduce this idea. The only Mexicans that were pro-slavery were the ones in northern Mexico. The ones closest to Texas, or they were in Texas. Why are they pro-slavery? They want cotton. Why do they want cotton? Because they want money. So they're pro-cotton, and pro-cotton means being pro-slavery. Got it? And so Tejanos don't reject slavery, just the reverse. The powerful ones in this area embrace the slavery because they want a piece of the cotton trade. Note the importance of Article 13 of the Saltillo Constitution. It looks like it's going to stop slavery, but Stephen F. Austin manages to kind of work around the Article 13. And I'll talk about that much more next week. So, but just know kind of this baseline that the discussions about slavery in the Constitution of 1824, they happen in Saltillo, not in Mexico City. And again, this will make a lot more sense after you listen to the podcast. Sorry, here I'm being slow, shutting down Zoom. Oh, I want to stop share.